the history of Islam itself. In the Meccan crucible, we understand that when the Prophet ﷺ was bringing this message of Islam to Mecca, to the Quraysh, to Arabia, that it was a message that was strange because the context was idolatry. It was a message that was the other, because all of them had simply been Arabs and all of them had simply been the Quraysh. And so wherever we come, we must encounter the fact that we will be seen as strange and we will be seen as the other. And so, as the other, we will either suffer from the blows of ignorance, and as the other, we will sometimes also have to suffer fear of us, a fear of the unknown. And I think that that is probably an experience that Muslims, particularly in the UK, in Europe, certainly in the USA, are beginning to experience. What you do with the sense that you are strange, what you do with the sense that you are the other. In the case of Muslims today, this is complicated because there are some who speak into the fear and who exacerbate the ignorance of Islam and Muslims because they appropriate our religion and they are able to give it a definition that is alien to the very genesis of Islam and the very purpose and intent of Islam in the world today. And so, before they see the ordinary billions of Muslims who next week will be embarking on the fast in the month of Ramadan, before they see all of those billions of Muslims acting simply on their devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they will first see again on their television screens the horror of groups who act in our name, who appropriate our religion, and distort what we stand for. And so we are almost in shifting sands, that as we go about our life, there are others who induce fear and who increase ignorance of us and what we stand for. And so I want to say to you that the lessons of South Africa and the lessons of Islam itself is that there is enormous hope in the way in which we can go forward in our lives. Whereas 350 years ago in South Africa, Muslims were feared and despised, Islam was banned and repressed. 350 years later, South Africa may be showing the way to what it means to be living in a Darul Shahada, in a place for the free profession of faith, the free profession of what you believe in, and the living out of all of that. South Africa may be leading the way in establishing a Darul Aman, a place of security for Muslims, where we can be who we are without suspicion, where we can be who we are without being profiled. In fact, 350 years later, it may be that Islam in South Africa may be living in what is a Darul Salam, a place of peace for Muslims, where we are respected and we respect everyone else around us. We give Lebensraum, we give space to live for others so that they give Lebensraum and space to live for us as well. And the recipe for this, going right back to the early Muslims in the time of our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when the Prophet himself was petrified at the enormity of his mission, when he was petrified by the enormity of the opposition against him, that people who had loved him so unconditionally before, at the moment that he proclaimed that he was a Muslim, that he proclaimed his faith in the kalima la ilaha illallah, and pronounced that he had indeed been anointed as Muhammadur Rasulullah by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he suddenly understood that there was a difference between standing there simply as a good person and standing there as a Muslim. And he went to his house, covered himself with his mantle, so much so that not even his beloved wife Khadija, may Allah be pleased with her, could comfort him. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him in this beautiful surah of Muzammil, oh, you covered in your shroud. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives him the recipe that we followed in South Africa and that you certainly must follow as you lead the way in the UK and in Europe for carving out the path towards a Darul Shahada, a Darul Aman, and a Darul Salam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "Wasbir ala ma yaqulun." Endure, be resilient with what they say to you. Wahjurhum ajran jamila, and give them the face of a beautiful dignity. It is this that is the primary response of Muslims in times of adversity, in times of suspicion, in times of challenge, in times of profiling, in times of strangeness, and in times of otherness. That we must endure what is said to us. Because the opposite of enduring what is said to us is confirming the stereotypes, is confirming the fear, it's confirming the ignorance, it's confirming the distortion. We've got to show the face of a beautiful dignity, never losing the sense of who we are, never abandoning our identity, never succumbing to what it is that people want us to be in their own image. And so the early Muslims in the Meccan crucible learned the power of endurance, of sabr, of strategic resilience, and they learned most of all the power of showing always the face of a beautiful dignity. Our injuries, our hurts, our humiliations must never ever allow us to lose our dignity. And we lose our dignity when we succumb to the violence they expect of us. We lose our dignity when we succumb to the anger that they try to induce in us. We lose our dignity when we become as humiliated as they want to humiliate us. And so it is not that we must become arrogant. It is that we must remain dignified. And the fine line between dignity and arrogance is a very thin line that we must never ever cross, even in the darkest of days. And so, just as the early Muslims, from the crucible of Mecca, and then moving on in the Hijrah, the strategic retreat to Medina, once they had been able to endure and obtain dignity, they were able then to spread, inshallah, to the four corners of the world, down to the south, the Sahara in Africa, the steppes in Europe. In the east they went to China, and in the west they went and established the civilization of Andalusia in Spain and the Iberian Peninsula. And from there, the rest is history. And just so, endurance and dignity has been the ally of the early Muslims, because when Nelson Mandela announced his first cabinet after 27 years in prison, after 4 years of negotiations, when Nelson Mandela announced his first cabinet, everyone was surprised to find that almost 9 of that cabinet members were Muslims. The first Minister of Justice was a Muslim. The Minister of Constitutional Affairs, the Minister of Water, the first Chief Justice of South Africa, and so we can go on to show how it has been that the resilience, endurance, and patience, while always maintaining the face of dignity, has worked for us. But it's more than simply withstanding the challenges. It is also the ability to make options for how you will live your life. Never will they determine that we will cower and succumb and assimilate or isolate ourselves. We decided in South Africa over the centuries to not simply give in, but to integrate ourselves. Maybe not initially in the whole of the nation, but certainly amongst the oppressed, those who are poverty-stricken, those who were facing their own otherness, those who were the victims of racism, of sexism, and a variety of other prejudices and discriminations. And so we did not glorify our own victimhood. We did not monopolize injury to us only. We did not seek to elevate what was done to Muslims in South Africa above what was done to blacks. above what was done to women, above what was done to Christians who spoke a liberation theology, even to Jews who stood with us in the struggle. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does exhort us to stand up firmly for justice as witnesses to Allah. But that's not the only iteration of that verse, because some Muslims hold on to the idea of just standing out for justice. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in a further iteration of that verse, tells us, stand out for justice, even against yourself and everyone that is like you. And so if you cannot stand for justice, even against yourselves, those fellow Muslims, those fellow Indians, those fellow Arabs, those fellow Africans, those who are like you, eat like you, pray like you, dress like you, if you can't stand out for justice against them even, then you have tainted the very definition of justice that you purport to stand for. In a further iteration of that same verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also tells us to stand out for justice. But Allah then adds to this the rider that says, and let not the hatred of a people to you swerve you from justice. Never mind how much you believe that people hate you. That is not a reason to depart from justice. Never mind how much you believe that they oppress you or are unjust to you. That is not a reason for you ever to compromise your own sense of justice. And so how do you navigate this enormous responsibility of being just? You've got to do it against people who are unjust from your own community. And you've got to do it despite the hatred of the people who hate you. Whether they are the Jews who hate you in Palestine, whether they are right-wing Europeans who try to get rid of you, whether they are just the apartheid state who have demonized you and who have made your religion illegal. How do you stand out for justice even against them? The truth, my dear brothers and sisters, is that justice is a double-edged sword, and we must be able to live with both those edges. It is a justice that says that if you believe it is unjust to oppress black people, then you must believe that it is unjust to oppress women. That if you believe it is unjust to stereotype and profile Muslims, then you must believe that it is unjust to stereotype and profile Jews. If it is that you believe that justice is for human beings, then it is as much that you must believe that justice is for the environment as well and all other creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, the truly just person is a warrior against racism, is a warrior against Islamophobia, is also a warrior against extremism, is also a warrior against climate change, is also a warrior against poverty, is also a warrior against anything that subtracts from the dignity of human beings and all creation. And that is the responsibility we have. We must never ever give up on the hope that the future will be better, inshallah, because that is the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I remember how it was that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, following the depths of oppression in Makkah, following how it was that the first martyr in Islam was a woman, Sumayya, may Allah be pleased with her. That the first person tortured in Islam was Bilal, a black person. May Allah be pleased with him. That the entire Muslim community was boycotted for 2 years and no one did business with them. How the Prophet thought that if he went to Taif and he met with the leadership of that community, that they may have far more mercy and far more love for Islam, for the early Muslims, and for him. How wrong you are. Created him. They set the children against him. They set the slaves against him. They set anyone who would be willing to be against him, they set against him. They stoned him and chased him out of Taif, so much so that the blood congealed on his sandals there was no gap between his sandal and the soles of his feet. And he took refuge in this orchard. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the angel Jibreel to him. And the angel Jibreel brought with him the angel of the mountains. And the two angels said to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, O Prophet, Allah has put at your disposal all of these mountains that surround Taif. And if you give the word, we will allow the mountains to converge on each other and crush everyone and everything in Taif, in between these mountains. And the Prophet ﷺ said, that is not his desire, because in future, inshallah, from amongst the progeny of the people of Taif, who had so humiliated him and injured him, will come generations that will believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and will be committed to a better world. And that is the hope that we work with in this world. It is that hope that overwhelms our anger. It is that vision of the future that overwhelms the tragedy of the present. It is that idea that we strive for, that may be intangible now and may be tangible in the future only beyond our own lifetimes. It is that that keeps us hopeful, and that keeps us faithful, and that keeps us within the bounds of the justice that we so fervently desire. And so, what it requires of us, in conclusion, is for us to make the investments in that future without even thinking that we will see that future. It's for us to understand that we need to not remain an isolated community, but we need to integrate, especially with those who are vulnerable and weak and poverty-stricken and victims of environmental change. We must be able to do as the Prophet ﷺ has advised us to do, to enter into khilful fudul, to enter into alliances and coalitions of the virtuous. Wherever virtue is striven for, we must be there, whether we lead it or whether we follow it, whether we are the minority or whether we are the majority, whether we are in leadership or not. We've got to be able to do that. And so it was that the Muslims in South Africa only achieved this Dar Shahada, this free abode of the profession and confession of faith, this abode of security and this abode of peace, because they've opted for the correct things at every intersection that life has offered us in South Africa. And therefore so many people know that Nelson Mandela was in prison for 27 years, because that's a global piece of information. But very few people know that in the cell right next to Nelson Mandela for over 26 years was someone called Ahmed Katrada, a young Muslim from a rural village who decided that he stood for justice, and that's how he ended up next to Nelson Mandela. Everyone knows how Steve Biko, one of the great black leaders of South Africa, was tortured to death by the apartheid police. Very few people know that in 1969, an imam from the Claremont Mosque in Cape Town, Imam Abdullah Harun, may Allah accept his sacrifice, he too was tortured to death in the torture chambers of apartheid. Everyone knows that Oliver Tambo spent 30 years in exile. Very few people know that in exile with him for almost all of that 30 years was Dr. Yusuf Dadu, a young person who was able to opt for justice. And so those are only the famous names. But at every turn, at every intersection, there were a sufficient critical mass of Muslims who flew our flag and hoisted our values so that they merged and integrated with the aspirations and the values of all South Africans. That's what we are required to do. That's what MADE gives you the opportunity to do. That's why you've got to grasp this opportunity. You may not be confronting an apartheid monster as we were required to do in South Africa, but there are enough other monsters. They don't drive around in tanks, and they don't beat you necessarily with whips, and they don't shoot you necessarily with bullets, and they don't jail you and incarcerate you in their dungeons. But there are other ways got to find it. That is your generation. That is the responsibility that you need to take up. And as Nelson Mandela teaches us, from the dock of the Supreme Court in Pretoria when he was sentenced to life imprisonment, he stood up there and said that I've cherished the ideal of a free and democratic South Africa. It is an ideal for which I desire to live, but it needs me. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. This was not an invocation to martyrdom by Nelson Mandela, because his first choice was to live for that ideal. In our case, what we learn out of that is that when you have decided what in life is so worthwhile living for, what in life is so worthwhile dying for, when you know what you're prepared to die for, you will know what you should be living for. And therefore, on a day like this, when you are gathered in May, when you are gathered together with other of your generation, you've got to countenance what is so worthwhile in life that you are prepared to lay your life down for. But then, in a counseling instinctive action, to those who flee to the battlefields of Syria and Iraq, who are willing to strap on their suicide vests, you've got to understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala requires you to live for the religion of Islam, not simply to die for it. The understanding of dying for something is simply to know what it is that you must live for and what it is that you are on earth to achieve. That, inshallah, is what it is that Allah requires of us. May Allah bless you. May Allah strengthen you. May Allah make you that generation that will have that strategic resilience, that will always show the face of dignity, that has a consciousness of what is so valuable in life that you must live for, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala infuses your imagination with a vision of the future that is so worthwhile that you dedicate every fiber of your being and every second of your life to its achievement. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make you the generation that will be the breakthrough generation, inshallah, in Europe, in the US, and wherever we are in the world, because our time has come. We are the ones who must even show our heartlands in North Africa, in the Middle East, where we are majorities. We've got to show them that life is about more than dictatorships, more than coup d'etats, more than all the injustices that oppress us, more than law and order, more than stability and the politics of order. We've got to show that we can embrace freedom, we can embrace democracy, we can embrace human rights, and that all of that are not alien to Islam, but they are germane to what it means to be a Muslim. Wallahu a'lam, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
There's three questions. The first one was, you spoke about hope extensively, and one of the people in the audience, he had the question, how, especially from your struggles during the anti-apartheid movement and during your career generally, how does one pick themselves up when facing such immense struggle? And what practical advice could you give on that? The second question was on breaking the narrative. There's obviously a dominant narrative, and often, you know, it's sometimes difficult for young people standing for truth or justice, or young Muslims, to really counter that narrative. What practical advice could you give for young people who really want to break that narrative? The third question was, you spoke about the line between dignity and arrogance, and what practical advice could you give in, you know, kind of not crossing that fine line between being confident, being a leader, you know, really being a beacon of change, but not crossing that path of arrogance? So those are the three questions.
Jazakallah khair, thank you very much. I think that now that I can also see you, I feel even worse that I am not able to be there with you and to interact with you, because it is for me one of those very diverse, except in age, communities that is there. Let me speak about this issue of hope. You know, for me the issue of is hopelessness that leads to desperation. When you have lost all sense of the future, that you are either so immersed in the present or bitterness from the past overtakes you. And therefore, I've always wondered, what is this notion? Because hope is almost the twin of faith. And I've always wondered why it is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran that faith is the belief in the unseen. Because that's what we are required to do, whether we are Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Jews, etc. We are required to believe in something that we have never seen, that can't necessarily be proven scientifically, that we can't put a set of dimensions on them. And that is the very definition of faith that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts to us in Surah Baqarah, that we believe in the unseen. And so, the unseen is not only the God that we worship. The unseen is also a vision of that better life, a vision of a future, where we may not have the details of it, but we have a few coordinates, that it will be a future that will be better in terms of being more just, that it will be a future where dignity will be in place, it will be a future that will be more peaceful, it will be a future that will have respect for the identities of people, it will be a future in which there will also be material enhancements to our lives, such as having the basic things, as some of the experts would say, the maqasid of Sharia, the objectives of the Sharia will be there. And so, this is what faith and what hope is all about. And that's why we've got to strengthen in our minds and in our imaginations what it is that we stand for. And therefore, that future is bigger than the present difficulties and the historical humiliations that we have faced. And it is that hope in the future that allowed the Prophet ﷺ, even while the blood was running from his body in Taif, to envisage a future not of the current generation, but of the subsequent generations that would believe. That he did not make himself the slave of that generation that humiliated him, but in fact made himself the harbinger, the arbiter of the future that will come to the people of Taif. In much the same way that when Nelson Mandela left the prison and everyone asked him, why are you not bitter? He said that if I leave here with anger and with bitterness, I would still be in prison. If I leave that anger and that bitterness behind me, then I have truly freed myself. So it is the ability to move from the past, to retain enough memory of the past to know what it is that you will never ever allow to return to. It's simply that your GPS says, don't ever go there again. But then to set it for a point along the future, to make our way towards the destination that is, and that's the definition of what hope and faith is in this life. It is the belief in the unseen, but not the unimagined. And that segues us into the issue of narratives. You see the difference between those of us who understand that we need a new paradigm for the future. And I don't call it a modernist paradigm or a progressive paradigm or a postmodern paradigm or anything of that. Because those are loaded political terms and each one of them come with too much baggage for us to carry that baggage along with us. Each one of them may have elements that may be part of that future. And so, for example, in the modernist paradigm, the technology that's available are the things that making this conversation possible, and so we embrace that part of it without embracing everything in it. In the postmodernist, the removal of superstition may be a very important element so that we are able to become far more rational and reasonable Muslims in our quest to go forward. And so that may be an element we take, but not necessarily the complete relativization package that comes with postmodernism. In being progressive, the orientation towards the poor and all of those kind of things is an element we can take, but not necessarily all the other baggage that may come with it. And so there may be elements in those things that constitute parts of the narrative. But I believe, and this is where the World for All Foundation says that the paradigm we speak about comes from, for example, the description in Surah Balad, the chapter in the Quran called the City, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that Allah has shown us the two paths. وَهَدَيْنَاهُ النَّجْدَيْنِ. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, almost disappointed, says, فَلَقَتَحَمَ الْأَقَبَةِ. Why have you not taken the Aqaba? Why do people not choose the steep path, the difficult path, the path less traveled? وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْأَقَبَةِ. And how can I describe to you what is the steep and difficult path? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins to tell us that the steep path is not to make salah and to fast and to go to Hajj. Allah takes that as being part of the definition of even being a Muslim. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that the path that is difficult, the Aqaba, is the path where you free people from slavery. Physical slavery then, but there's so much other kinds of slavery. That whether they are physical slavery, like human trafficking, or whether there's financial slavery, or whether there is the slavery of women, what disempowered, or the slavery of an entire continent because it is black in the economic backwaters of the world. Allah says it's feeding in the day of hunger, whether it is the orphans that you know or the strangers who are unknown to you. And so Allah goes on to give this definition of what is the absolute goals of Muslims and what it means to be on the Aqaba. But you see, the competing paradigm against the Aqaba, this forward-looking one, this one that embraces the future, that establishes visions of where we are going to, when we are on this steep and difficult path. Against that one is competing a far more extremist, almost nihilistic vision, with all the elements of fundamentalism about it, because it's lodestars. The lodestars of extremism lie not in the future that guides its way forward, but lies in the past. It says there was once this perfect society to which we must return. And so it's a back to the future scenario. It is one that cannot embrace the complexity of the current and the even more complex world that we are trying to realize when we ascend this Aqaba, the steep and difficult path. It is one that looks for the simplicity of the past, when we knew who we were, when societies were monocultural, when you didn't have to deal with those who were different from you, spoke different languages, dressed differently, and challenged your values. A yearn for the world in the past that is uncomplex. And so, when we construct this narrative, It is really to understand not simply the rules that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts to us. How to pray, how to fast, how to do this, how to do that, what's allowed, what's not allowed. We've got to be able to understand those kind of things. But the one thing that will be absolutely crucial to take us on this aqaba, the steep and difficult path on the way forward, is a firm sense of our destination. Is this narrative about what it is that we are trying to construct. And then, from this to construct the pathways and to debate the pathways. Otherwise, we deal too much with inherited pathways and become trapped in those pathways. I was struck many years ago when I read Dr. Ali Shariati, and he said that the problem of the Ummah today is that it has begun to worship the path and have forgotten to make haste towards the destination. And so we need to redefine that destination for us. And so I would say that in the how of that narrative, we know what it is not. It cannot even compromise with the expressions of extremism. We cannot even equivocate. You see, when we equivocate with extremism because they do something that is recognizable to us. So for example, we all get injured and hurt when Charlie Hebdo portrays the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam even negatively, because we know that we have a fundamental problem with depiction in Islam. Our discomfort with that cannot be an endorsement of the ones who stand up and fight. Our confusion about, say for example, Sharia cannot be a reason for giving a free pass to the Taliban. For example, when they establish a version of Sharia in Afghanistan that oppresses women and bombs the statues of Bamiyan. And so we know, often by contradistinction, what the narrative is not, and therefore, even if our own narrative is not clear yet, we must be firm on what it is not. And then from there, construct that narrative that is consistent with the paradigm of the Aqaba, of the steep and difficult path, which by definition is one that doesn't come with easy answers. And it's going to take groups like this to create first the scaffolding for that narrative. You've got to know what are the core values of Islam, what are the normative values of the Quran, so that those become the lodestars on the construction of this this narrative. And we have seen, for example, the yearning for some of those lodestars to be realized in places like Egypt, like Libya, like Syria, like Iraq, like Bahrain, like Yemen, and many other places where the Arab Spring, for example, emerged. But we've also seen the fierceness, the ferocity of counter-revolution in those areas. Because those who challenge us all the time to bring about a better version of Islam in this world, to show what it means to be a community that is in the middle, an ummatan wasatan, a community that embraces rights and freedom and democracy. Those who challenge us constantly to stand for that did not have the patience or did not have the desire to allow it to take place and to take root within the Arab Spring. And they stood by or assisted in destroying the laboratories. However messy those experiments may have been, they allowed the laboratories of those values to be eliminated. And so part of our narrative is about saying, however messy and murky it may be, we've got to allow that very nascent yearnings towards democracy, freedom, human rights, and the values of inclusion and equality and so forth to take root, and it can't be held hostage at the altar of the geopolitics of the region and the needs of dictators in those regions and the needs of Western powers to have strong governments rather than inclusive governments. And so this narrative is also about understanding the lone stars of the geopolitical situation in the world. The narrative is also about understanding what it means to be a minority, how to choose integration rather than assimilation, because the two are fundamentally different. Assimilation has at its root to become the same. We are an addition to the beautiful mosaic of Britain, of America, of South Africa, of France. We are not here to be just another one to be put through the mold of the pre-existing Frenchness, Britishness, Americanness, or South Africanness. We have something to add to it, to enrich it. We must also, as a minority, understand that what we ask for ourselves, we must give to others. If we want freedom, rights, humanity, dignity, respect, and so forth, we cannot get it if we do not give it even to others that we don't like, whose lifestyles we may detest, and whose very behavior may challenge our sensibilities. Because when we give it to them, we guarantee for ourselves as well. And so this narrative is a double-edged sword, to use that metaphor again. It first cuts inwards, just like justice, before it cuts outwards. And so what I'm inviting you to is a conversation and a debate about what it means to be on the narrative of the Aqaba, the steep and difficult path, which by definition means there are no easy answers. And this means, therefore, that the issue of dignity versus arrogance and how we don't cross those lines becomes a very important issue for us. We see arrogance when it gets screened in social media and on television screens as they cut the necks of those they believe whose blood may be halal for them, permissible for them. We see the arrogance of a false confidence that they know Islam and that they are intimately connected to God and that they are God's servants on this earth to do as they believe must be done. That's arrogance. But arrogance is not only violent. Arrogance is also attitudinal. When we act with a haughtiness about us, when our Islam does not come across as a humble one, when we substitute the innate humility that comes from being a Muslim at the altar of false certainties that we hold up. And so, for example, in South Africa, alhamdulillah, there was not too many Muslims who wanted to replace the apartheid system with the projection of an Islamic revolution and Islamic solutions. There was a group in South Africa who said the only solution is Islamic revolution. The rest of us had to say, let's be humble. Let's first get people to simply affirm their humanity. Let's ensure that there are rights for people. Let's ensure that there's inclusion and equality in our society. Let's not speak as if we are the custodians of only the finest values. Theoretically, maybe. Theologically, we wouldn't be Muslims if we didn't believe that we have the best coordinates for the future of humanity. But our humility must come from the fact that in our name, terrible things have been done. With our silence, sometimes, we have allowed fear to penetrate the hearts of non-Muslims. And out of that humility, we must take our place. And the reason that dignity is such a wonderful concept is because it allows you to be rooted in humility, but assertive in your identity. And so, rooted in that humility, but being very confident about who you are, is the thing that I think we need to take into this world. It is when we have no portion of what was done in our name and what we are allowed to be doing, and how our equivocation and often allowed extremists take center stage, that we now believe that not only are we not the problem, we now believe intimately and vociferously that we are also just the solution. And so I think that we must take our ideas into the marketplace of ideas, not isolate ourselves in the superior belief that we have the answers. We have to fight for the veracity of those answers, first against contenders within our ummah, and then in debate with other worldviews that are there. It is a nutritional thing. It is a dialectical process that we are building, and always we must carry this double-edged sword. Deal with those within who detracts and who have better means to define the narrative, and at the same time hold it up as a beacon for the world. And the dignity that we show is always to keep that smile on our face, always to subsume our anger with our faith. And inshallah, that is one way in which the Muslims of South Africa have been able to not only survive apartheid, but after apartheid. And may Allah bless you and give you the insights to take further just some of these ideas, and forgive me for not being able to answer the questions probably to the satisfaction that you may have expected.